So, traditional Jewish, Christian, or Muslim.
Atheist and
We just need to reach the limit to know what the limit is.
Feeling pretty confident it's not going to happen in regular dialogue.
Yeah, we'd have to get pretty passionate about this. Hey, Preston. Nope.
It needs to be right over that leg, otherwise it's coming down.
That's what she said.
Hi, Katie.
Hi, Preston.
Oh, man. What are we doing?
What are we doing today? Sharing the wealth.
Wealth of knowledge on the
Holy Watermelon Podcast.
It's a bit of a stretch, but here we are.
We could share other wealth, too.
Sure. If I had some to share.
That's fair.
Today we're going to talk about communism and socialism more broadly.
Cue the Soviet national anthem, please.
But this is not an economics podcast, so we're going to focus more on how this sort of nonsense gets tied to religion. And when I say nonsense, I mean people's reactions to communism.
Or
not
even
communism.
Even that we look to our religious leaders to make political or economic decisions for us. In this day and age, blows my mind. I guess it's a residual from a time when you would have.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't need to ask your priest who to vote for politically anymore. You can decide that for yourself.
Right. Yeah. No, the church I belong to is fairly diverse, and there's people on both sides of this political divide.
I think in most religions, there's people on both sides of economic political divide.
In the good ones, I would expect so. But if there's anything that makes the conservative religious crowd freak out as much as allowing personal autonomy for women and homosexuals and anybody who isn't the straight white dude in charge, basically, it's the idea of communism. And, I mean, all the best cults lean pretty hard into communism.
I mean, yeah.
Join our little farm. Everything's going to be dandy.
Here, words guy. Did you know communism and commune come from the same root word?
I'm not the tiniest bit surprised. This is what I have fully expected.
So if you ever talked about living on commune, I have. You might have some communist tendencies. Community, also.
Yeah. Well, that which is common. It's a pretty good thing. Yeah. And it's really frustrating because most of the most visible forms of communism that we've seen over the years also rely very heavily on authoritarianism. So much to the point that a lot of people get really confused and think one is the same as the other.
Well, they kind of come back full circle. There's a point where the line blurs, and then you're just... I think even right and left wing politics do that, where if you get so extreme action, yeah, exactly, eventually you meet in the middle. So yeah, and in some of our examples, right, we know communes can work, but then you get the problem of where it's so big. Now you need a hierarchy, which is counter to a commune.
I mean, you can have authoritarian communism, like we've seen plenty of, and there's plenty of anarchist communism,
right?
And anarchist communism in large groups is doomed to fail, for sure. You do need leadership. There needs to be somebody making decisions on how you're interacting financially with the world outside your commune, all kinds of stuff. But when they're dictators, that's when you're going to have a real problem.
Well, but that's hard because how do you get people to agree? You need a final decision maker. You see this in business all the time. Right. People trying to do lateral leadership in business, but you need a final decision maker. Nothing gets done.
Yeah.
So
democracy is pretty great for a lot of reasons.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And a lot of people love saying, oh, communism is so dangerous because they've tied it to authoritarianism. Libertarianism, more or less the opposite of authoritarianism, combined with capitalism, more or less the opposite of communism, has also caused all of the same terrible problems.
Yep. It's weird. It's like moderation, like we talk about on our podcast, is somehow a good thing.
Right?
Weird.
Funny how that works. Now, we should talk about some definitions of what we're really talking about here. Unfortunately, much like the word religion, socialism also is kind of a tricky thing to peg down.
Yep.
If you want a concise definition and one that's broadly accurate, you're going to have a bad time. It just doesn't work that way.
But Preston's going to try.
There's so many different forms of socialism. But generally, the one thing they have in common is the idea of social ownership of services or products. And there's a lot of different ways that that gets implemented as well. Communism is a kind of socialism, a very specific kind that it is fairly counted separately in most conversations, where communism is group ownership of everything, without exception. That the public library would be the idea of a place where you could get the car that you need this week, as well as the books and video games and whatnot. Doesn't sound that terrible if implemented correctly and equitably and justly, which is where things fall apart because people suck.
Yep. Same reason capitalism falls apart is because people suck.
Exactly. Wealth distribution, super important to socialism. Generally, we're distributing wealth to elevate the poor. Eliminating poverty is fully impossible. The most frustrating thing about poverty is that it is a relative measure, which means that it will be redefined as circumstances evolve. Right now, poverty for us is people have a hard time surviving. It'd be pretty nice if poverty could be redefined to people who have just a little bit less. That'd be cool. But that's not our reality right now.
Yeah, I think in Canada, living below the poverty line means you make, I think it's less than $40,000 a year. But obviously, 30 years ago, that number would have been different.
Yeah. The difference is what is the buying power of the dollar?
Inflation.
What is it that you need
Yep.
to live the good life? All kinds of things.
Yeah, what is the basic standard of living where you are? Right, living in Toronto is much more expensive than in Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
So that changes the poverty line just within the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if we can eliminate the can't afford to live class, not by wiping them out, but by elevating that poverty group, that's a win for every decent human being. Mm-hmm. But of course, there's people who want to fight against even that, and that sucks. Mm-hmm. The variety of socialist philosophies and social economic policies, way too diverse to be more specific on what socialism is. Really, it's a lot of things, a lot of different ideas.
Is it a spectrum?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Ideologies range from totalitarian to anarchist, like I said before, that word I was looking for. I did write it down in my notes.
Good. Good.
But a lot of people really think of socialism as this boogeyman.
Russia.
Right. Mostly Russia. People also talk about Cuba, China, all that nonsense. The Soviet Union and everybody who modeled their political philosophy and economic philosophy off of them was essentially founded on Marxist ideas to begin with. But the way they operated their authoritarian command market was fully corrupt. And I mean, you look at Stalin, super murderous. That's not an accident. That's just terrible people in charge. Mm-hmm. And they hoarded wealth themselves so that they could look good while they traveled abroad. And a lot of economists are recognizing, oh yeah, that wasn't actually socialism. It was just really, really messed up capitalism.
Yep. Yeah, because they kept the poor.
Yeah. And I mean, Russia hasn't changed a whole lot since the fall of the Soviet Union. You still have a very small number of very rich people and everyone else has nothing.
Yeah.
That's not communism. That's capitalism.
But there are some good examples of communism, communes, or socialism in action. Hippie communes.
So much fun.
So much fun if you like marijuana or LSD or planting plants and singing songs.
Right?
These were obviously incredibly popular in the 1960s and 70s during the hippie movement.
Mm-hmm.
But you can still find commune living today. There are about 3,000 communes in the United States in these decades.
That's a lot.
It is. Even if you think that, I think I have the stats somewhere in here, that there was about 10 or so families to a commune.
Okay.
So let's say 40 to 60 people times 3,000. It's like 20,000 people living in communes. Is that right? Let's say.
Sure. That's a conservative estimate.
Probably.
Yeah, it was a lot of people.
There's a lot of people.
And when communes are smaller, it's pretty easy to make sure everything is just and equitable, but a little harder to have some real economic power for dealing with outsiders.
Absolutely, which we'll get into.
Yeah.
Commune life is characterized by members sharing basically everything. In some weirder communes or cults, this even includes sexual partners.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I want to judge polygamy or polyamory, but if you're in a danger cult and aren't consenting,
that's when you've got problems. Authoritarian versus libertarian communism.
The idea is that you share the necessities for life, whether that be food, clothing, resources, or skills. If you're living in a commune, it is expected that you're an active contributor to the function of said commune.
Much like in capitalism, we expect people to contribute.
Have you ever looked into cooperative housing?
I can't say that I have.
I have recently for a client, but someone told me about cooperative housing years ago, and there's some in our city.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically that. So you get subsidized rent, but whatever skills you have, it's expected you bring them to it's typically apartment or townhouse style condominiums. So rent's way cheaper, but if you're a handyman,
you're going to be helping out.
You're going to be helping out.
That's fine.
That
makes sense.
I kind of love that.
Mm-hmm.
Because rent is very high in the city.
Right. Should we start a commune?
I mean, we could definitely add it to part of our Holy Watermelon Foundation.
Right.
Communal living. It is easy, like Preston said, for tribes or for communes to develop a tribe mentality. But people have almost always lived communally, dating back as far as early Neolithic tribes. So really this idea of...
Capitalism is new.
Yeah.
And clearly problematic. Communism, while it has its problems, has worked for a long time.
Yeah. So while hippie communes weren't necessarily found in religion, they were basically mini cults, but I'm not saying that they were danger cults necessarily, but you do get this hive mentality of obviously protecting what's yours and working together. And
there's usually a charismatic figure that pulled everybody together to begin with.
That was like, let's do this thing.
Yeah.
There.
Doesn't mean it's dangerous. It just has made a lot of people very uncomfortable.
I have a friend and I kind of love it. She wants to start like a commune with her girlfriends where there's like 5 or 6 houses all together.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that she stays married to her husband, but husbands don't do anything. So when she actually needs help, all her girlfriends would be there to help.
Okay.
And she wouldn't have to rely on the honey-do list that never gets done anymore. And I was like, I love that. Sorry, Brian. And I'm talking to a husband right now, so you're probably also offended by that.
I can easily choose not to be offended.
Thank you.
But yeah, there's perks to communal living, for sure. In fact, a lot of religious groups have leaned into communal living over the course of history, even as deliberately separate from the rest of the broader community. And usually we see them in things like monasteries, which exist in a lot of religious traditions. The Indo-Aryan ashrams have been around since at least 1500 BCE. So good 3.5 millennia. I was going to say centuries. That's the wrong word.
Longer.
3.5 millennia these ashrams have been around.
Wow.
Pythagoras started a vegetarian commune when he was about 50, which is kind of cool. I mean, he did also have a pretty serious cult-like following.
I mean, I love the Pythagorean theorem, so...
I mean, that's handy. His religion was very science and math-based, mostly.
Do we have to do an episode on him?
I think we might have to.
Okay.
But he did live a culty life. It was kind of cool.
The vegetarian piece intrigues me mildly.
Right? I mean, You don't have to go off into the woods to hunt stuff.
I guess so. And
Safer.
back then, yeah. Fair.
Buddhists have also been building monasteries since around the same time, the late 6th century. So that's kind of cool. BCE. 6th century BCE.
Yeah, when you're that close to zero,
Yeah.
you got to clarify.
Yeah. The Qumran community, the group that's famous for producing the Dead Sea Scrolls, was also a puritanical commune. They're like, those other Jews are far too liberal for us. Those city Jews and their Greekness, even though, I mean, the people of Jerusalem weren't super Greek. There were Greek elements, but it was way too much
Greek for them.
for the Qumran
Fair
community. And then, of course, Christians famously picked up the tradition very early in their history with building up monasteries all over the place and having monks and friars and whatnot.
Absolutely. And then, I mean, I guess this is historical, but then we see a whole bunch of modern day cults living communally too.
Yeah. So there's a pretty strong historical element of communes that are seen as people that are in the mainstream, more or less, looking at these communes as people living the ideal closer to God life.
Mm-hmm.
And here we are in 21st century North America, where most people of faith look at communists and the communist tradition as fully evil, which is just weird.
Which, kind of back onto the word thing, if you ask the average person on the street, is community a good thing? And to define community, they would basically be defining communism.
Yeah.
Right? Our community league asks for volunteers and helpers, whether that's a food drive or to paint the skating rinks or whatever, and to know your neighbors and to help your neighbors. While it's not communal ownership, there's like maybe social communism.
Mm-hmm.
That's
well, even the stock market, buying shares in a company, that's a form of socialism, which gets even worse when you have governments bailing out these companies that actually don't need the help. That's another really frustrating form of socialism.
I read some meme somewhere, and some lady was losing her shit about paying 5 cents for a bag and was calling everyone communist and socialist. And the cashier was like, ma'am, paying for a bag is capitalism. Me giving you a bag for free is socialism.
Yep.
Because I treat everyone equally then, not based on whether they have money or not.
Mm-hmm. People way too often get way too confused about what socialism is.
I mean, I don't think it's any secret that we're in Alberta.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a huge problem here, where people will spew their beliefs and then say they vote for the Conservative Party. And it's like, those things don't match, because you don't realize that they don't match, especially in very conservative Alberta.
The civic religion is really frustrating, that a lot of people don't realize that they are sticking with their party for what amounts to religious
reasons. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a different episode.
Like their commitment is fully religious without any thought. There's those people who go to church every Sunday or twice a year or anywhere in between without thinking about the details.
Yeah.
And people will go to the ballot box in the exact same mindset.
Yeah.
It's frustrating.
Yep.
But anyway, these monasteries, the idea is to separate yourself from the ungodly pursuits of the wider public culture, especially like we saw in the Qumran community. That's pretty easy narrative to get yourself figured out around. Asceticism is thought to be the ideal, and it is definitely the deal with these things. You renounce all personal possessions, you give everything you have to support the community, and then you work to meet the needs of that community, and you'll get the benefits coming back at you. I was going
to say, and then ideally, you receive what you put in return.
Yeah.
You're the handyman, and then you need an electrician because that's dangerous, and he just does it for you because you did something for him.
Yeah.
Or someone bakes you a pie.
Yeah. Your life is comfortable because you're helping out in a community.
Yeah.
Communism. Or at least socialism.
Right.
And I want to look a little bit deeper into how some of these traditions get preserved in Christianity in a few different forms.
Sure.
So mainstream Christianity has typically really emphasized this phrase of be in the world but not of the world. Means interact with your neighbors, but don't be like your neighbors.
Be better than your
Exactly.
neighbors.
And a lot of people are really bad at that.
Please see our last episode.
Yeah. So anyway, capitalism as well as prosperity churches have shown that they sometimes don't even really work that hard to walk that line. It's frustrating. But a few groups have fully embraced communism in a way that actually separates them from the world, leaning the other way to fail in this, be in the world but not of the world. And that's kind of become a weird popular form of Christian totalitarianism, especially within the Anabaptist movement. We've got a few different Hutterite branches. There's a lot of Hutterites in the plains of Canada and the United States.
The Northwest United States.
Yeah. So Jacob Hutter established the first Hutterer colonies, and later came to be known as the Hutterites, back in 1528. So almost 500 years ago.
Very long time ago.
Big anniversary coming up for them.
Nice. Will they celebrate? No one knows.
Not likely. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I'm guessing. And
okay.
With zero real feeling behind the guess. But after centuries of moving around the world, they went to Russia after they got pushed out of Germany, and then ended up here in North America. And there's about 570 Hutterite colonies around the world. The number might be a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller. It fluctuates. And there's some in Japan, apparently.
Yes. That was really interesting. They aren't related. They just a group of Japanese people that got the stamp of approval to be Hutterites.
That's cool.
We'll talk about that more when we get to our Hutterite episode. But yeah, so 569 of the colonies are here. And there's one in Japan.
Okay. That's pretty cool. So everything is owned by the colony in these situations. They are fully communist. And then there's a minister who's in charge, and he gets to make a lot of the decisions. Most of the financial decisions and arranging who gets what is the job of the secretary, actually. Most. And there's a little bit of a variation from one group to the next.
Did you look into how this person is appointed, elected, hired? Does it change every year? I'm just curious.
I actually don't know the answer to that.
Just again, kind of back to that fairness thing, to keep it from being a dictatorship, to have turnover elected democratically, or I
don't know the answer to that.
We'll look into it.
Yeah. So company owns everything, and they cite a couple of passages in the Acts of the Apostles in the Christian Bible where it says that they had all things in common. This describing the church. And as much as a lot of Christian thinkers like to deny that communism was ever practiced in Christianity, it absolutely was. It's in black and white in the Acts of the Apostles. It's super obvious. If you're intellectually honest, you'll see it.
Yes.
And so the Hutterites really jumped onto this and said, this is the way we want to live our life. This is the way God wants us to live it. So we're going to do it. And we've got 500 years of this tradition working for them.
Mostly.
I mean, there's weirdness. There are some bad actors, as there are in any group, but they still are economically surviving just fine.
That's true. They are actually, where we are, there are some very wealthy colonies. Mm-hmm. You can find them at farmers markets. They're big farm communities, so produce, meat, very, very wealthy communities. Yeah. They don't have to pay taxes because they are a religious group. So some people don't like supporting the Hutterites here because they make a bunch of money and don't have to pay taxes. Fun fact that I've included. Mm-hmm. Hutterites are so closed off. You can't just convert to Hutteritism.
Joining
you can't just
a colony is so hard.
Yeah, it's not like I could walk into a Christian church and they'd me up, right? So Hutterites generally don't want you.
They're very suspicious of outsiders.
Why someone would want to join. They are one of the most inbred communities in the world.
Yeah, it's tricky. When the colony gets too big, they split, and they will very often look to other communities that aren't so closely genetically related to hopefully keep them safe, genetically speaking.
Yeah, so they'll typically send their daughters out to a new community. Mm-hmm. And they keep really close track of genetics because it's an issue.
Yeah, they do keep close track. There's this urban myth that's been going around for decades at least.
Which I just heard today.
You'll hear somebody say, oh yeah, the Hutterites picked me up, put me in the back of their truck and paid me $50 to knock up a few of their daughters. There's some huge problems with the idea of that happening.
Theologically.
Yeah, it's strictly forbidden to have sex outside of marriage in the Hutterite tradition, as in almost every Christian tradition.
And adultery.
Yeah. We got a lot of reasons why this is a bad policy. And everybody who has made the claim, who has said, oh yes, I've experienced this, because you hear a lot about, oh yeah, my uncle told me, but everybody who says, I have done this, they can't substantiate their claim at all.
Fair.
If you are one of these people who has told people and you can back it up, I guess I'd like to hear about that.
I would like to. Parts of it.
Yeah, I don't need the gross details, but whatever. Let's move on. Yeah. So Hutterites are allowed to leave, generally speaking, but it's hard to leave a Hutterite colony because everything you have is owned by the company of the colony. So you don't get to take a whole lot with you when you go. And some families are more generous than others. Some might give you a little bit of money to see you on your way so that you don't freeze overnight kind of deal. But that's not the norm, which does make it look a little bit culty sometimes.
They also if you're one of the ones coming to the farmers markets every week, you probably do speak English, but day to day, they don't speak English.
Yeah, they speak German usually.
And it's but it's not like German.
No, it's Hutterite German.
It's Hutterite German. So I kind of compare it to Yiddish was this amalgamation of German and Hebrew.
Right.
And that's kind of what Hutterite German is.
Yeah, it's kind of nifty.
Yeah, it is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. And then if a Hutterite wants to keep going to church when they leave a Hutterite colony, they very often will end up joining a Mennonite church. They're theologically identical, or at least very similar. Of course, variety, diversity, because people. The Mennonites are closely connected. I want to say Hutter
and Menno knew each other.
Yeah. They had a lot of agreements on things, but didn't agree on the communal living.
Right.
And so it's an easy conversion for Hutterites when they leave the colony. I'm curious if a Mennonite would be more welcomed to join a Hutterite colony than the average other outsider.
I don't know. I'd love to interview a Hutterite.
Sure. Might be able to hook that up. We'll see.
All right.
It's kind of cool.
Wish you a very Merry Christmas.
Do the Amish celebrate Christmas?
I don't actually know.
You know what they definitely don't do is put electric lights around a tree.
Absolutely not. So the Amish are another Anabaptist group that live communally. The big difference between the Amish and the Hutterites is the Amish are scared of technology, whereas the Hutterites 100% use GPS combines.
Yeah, for sure. Because why not?
Because work is meant to make you sweat.
Absolutely. This idea comes from Genesis, where you'll get your bread by the sweat of your brow. And the Hutterites are like, well, we can do it better. And the Amish are like, but we're going to be better. So, and then you got perks either way.
And the Hutterites wipe their brow with all their money.
Right.
Because they can produce more.
Yeah. But it's not just the Anabaptists that are into communal living historically. Back in the 1830s, Joseph Smith was way into communism. So a couple years ago, I was talking to the missionary that was teaching me before I was baptized. I haven't actually seen
a couple
either
years
of them in
ago.
a while.
I feel like this. Were you only baptized a couple of years ago?
No, I was talking to him a couple of years ago.
Oh, the ones who came in.
Yeah.
It sounded like you were only baptized. I understand. I'm with you.
I was baptized 20 years ago, give or take a little change. And
a couple years ago,
talking to one of the missionaries that was the one
I'm
teaching me. And she had started this conversation with communism is bad. And it was a really weird conversation because, like, I hadn't said anything pro-communism up to this point. And then I'm like, well, you do know Joseph Smith was a communist, right? And she's naturally a big fan of Joseph Smith. She immediately blocked me. I've never heard from her since.
Oh, no.
And it was such a weird exchange.
Yes.
I mean, to be that immediately offended by the statement Joseph Smith was a communist feels like you don't know anything about it.
Yes. Yeah.
But in the early 1830s, very shortly after establishing the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which at the time was just the Church of Christ, Joseph instituted the United Order, which was also known by a couple other pseudonyms for legal reasons. They wanted to actually keep it super hush-hush that it was a communist group. But if you read the church's publications, the Doctrine and Covenants is a good example where they lay out a whole bunch of specific commands telling the bishop, you're going to deal with these things, all kinds of stuff like that. It's super obvious that it was communism. To deny that is fully ludicrous. That everybody was meant to be equal in all measures of wealth, every member of the church without exception. And bishops were to receive everything that you had that you didn't need and would redistribute so that everybody's needs were met. That is communism.
Well, and even today, from my understanding, jump in obviously if I'm misinformed, but we know the LDS Church has a tithe, a mandatory tithe and a high tithe, but you also have your food stores. And I know you have your fast day, but I mean, it looks like from the outside, if you're a member of the church, you're pretty well taken care of if you're in a decent community or ward. Yeah.
It's a little different when you have a bishop who is super anti-socialist and is super withholding.
But the food stores are like a real thing.
Yeah. And you talk to the Relief Society president and they'll give you your checklist of, I want 4 cans of pork and beans and 2 turkeys and 3 watermelons and 4 blocks of cheese.
Thank you for saying watermelons.
And then you take that checklist to the bishop's storehouse and you get that stuff for free.
Yeah.
As long as the bishop consents.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So would there be a reason to store food and not give it away?
None at all.
Okay.
What's food for? Eating.
Is it for eating? Because then you have your fast day. And is it the money you save from not eating or the food you would save from not eating? You don't eat. I guess the bishop storehouse manages what they eat.
Money. Yeah. And everybody's encouraged to give generously. The baseline suggestion is, the money that you would have saved by not eating, pass it along so that somebody else can eat when they don't get to normally. And if you're serious about helping out your neighbors and you have the means, a generous fast offering is pretty standard. Yeah. Of course, the church didn't stick around with this united order for very long. A few elders abused the system, and also Joseph Smith made some really poor banking decisions. And then the whole church is just like, screw it. This united order thing is not okay because I'm greedy. I want to keep my stuff for me. I work hard. I'm a capitalist. Communism is not okay for me because I want to be rich and I don't care about you guys. And that's the way we see capitalism work.
Yeah. Modernly, we have koinonia farm. And I found this in our research. It's looks like a non-denominational Christian farm in Georgia where you can go and stay for some good old-fashioned communal living.
Okay.
The name comes from the Greek word meaning common or shared life. But it looks like it's more like a retreat, like you'd stay for 2 months or 4 months or 6 months.
Okay.
And then you'd move
So it
along.
let you try out communal life.
I mean, I'm sure there's people who are long-term tenants, but
Probably.
to get back to the earth and to Jesus.
Okay. That's kind of nifty.
I mean, we should go for a week.
Is it really communal living if you're only going to do it for a week?
I guess it depends how much money they take from us.
I guess so. It's really weird. I mentioned this before. There's a lot of scholarly debate about whether the first generation of Christians practiced communism.
Yes.
I don't understand why it's a debate.
Because, I mean, even if you just looked at the date, everyone was still living, for the most part, communally then. I guess we obviously had imperialism and emperors and things like that. But for the most part, any sort of small town or village would be pretty communal.
Pretty communal. Like, not full community owns everything business, but...
A lot of help your neighbor and...
Oh, yeah, for sure, a lot of that.
Becky knows how to bake, and because there would be a Becky in the first
century. There would
century.
be a lot of socialist action.
Yeah.
Not necessarily socialist government policies
Fair.
Everywhere. But it's not a big step away from communism. Anyway, it really bugs me that there is scholarly debate on whether there was communism practiced in early Christianity. It just doesn't feel like there's intellectual honesty in that argument. The Acts of the Apostles in every Christian Bible outlines in the first 5 chapters that they did not hold personal property. It was banned. And chapter 5 specifically tells the story of a couple who were killed for withholding their wealth from the church.
Jesus whipped the bankers.
He did. Because they were trying to make a profit off of a religiously mandated system. So yeah, Jesus was pissed off about that. The only genuine debate that scholars can have on the matter and still be intellectually honest is how long communism persisted in the church. Some people say that it was less than a month, which...
That just feels like a pain.
Right?
I'm not giving you my property for 3 weeks or less.
Right?
It's just more of a administrative headache.
Yeah, some people say that it was just because a bunch of people were in town too long for the Pentecost, which, if you read the Acts of the Apostles, that argument falls flat on its face real hard. The Pentecost was 5 weeks after, or 50 days, not 5 weeks, 50 days, about 7 weeks after Passover when Jesus died. It was this great outpouring of the Spirit and great miracles were seen. And so people who stuck around to see that stuck around a little bit longer to see what's going on with this community. And so a lot of people argue that they just asked for donations to help house these people for the extra few days or whatever it was. That's nonsense. If you're killing people for withholding money, that's communism. A lot of people like to say, well, Paul said that God prefers a willing giver and that if you don't want to give, you shouldn't give. Well, if you're a biblical literalist, God killed this couple for withholding money. And any other position, other than this whole book is fiction, the reasonable intellectual conclusion is the church killed these people for withholding their money. So enforced communism was a real thing and would not have happened if they were looking at a very short temporary thing. That's nonsense. But in this setting, Israel and Judah had legislated some pretty intense socialist policies. The corners of every field were the right of every beggar. Nobody was ever going to go hungry because farmers were not allowed to harvest from the corners of their fields. And now you see a lot of farmers not even seeding the corners of their fields because, yay, capitalism. charging interest on debts was forbidden.
Usury, yep.
Yeah. I mean, the Jewish population changed their policy on that in the Middle Ages, around the Renaissance, I guess.
The line in the Bible that I heard in religious studies is like, you're not allowed to charge interest to your own people or to the people. And Christians took that as everyone, and Jews just took it as other Jews. Which I kind of love.
Yeah. I mean, the Merchant of Venice is a great popular story that you see this come up as an issue. Also, all debts were to be forgiven every 7 years, regardless of how long the debt was in place or how big it was.
That could come back.
Right? That'd be just fine. Oh no, I went 7 years without paying off my student loans. Thanks. Oh, my mortgage, 25-year term? Nope.
Oh. Interest rates would go up.
But I mean, if we're going to use the Bible to defend this 7-year cycle, we're going to get rid of interest.
I love that.
I mean, loans are super predatory right now anyway, and it's probably only going to get worse.
Yep.
Also, there were different sacrifices to be offered by poor people for the same blessings that everyone else was getting. So you didn't need
to bring a whole cow if you can afford a whole cow.
Yeah. If you're poor and you can only catch a pigeon, then that's okay. That's a valid sacrifice.
I appreciate that.
Right?
It's kind of cute.
A pigeon is
like when a kid pays for a candy with some pebbles and a button, you're like, you can have the candy.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this hardcore capitalism was really not okay in the eyes of the Jewish people until, more recently, when that was how they needed to survive, because Christians have sucked for a long time as neighbors. The Jesus we have on record was not really vocal about political or economic policies, but I mean, to say that he was socialist is a very fair representation of fact. He demanded the unqualified liberation of prisoners.
Wow.
Yeah. He commanded people to sell everything they had and then give all of that money from the sale to poor people.
That's pretty extreme, because now you're poor.
Right? And he commanded this fairly often by the looks of it. He condemned people who tried to profit from religious and civil laws. Like, do your job, cool. But if you want to get rich off of doing this thing that we straight up need as a community, no, that's not cool.
Scientology, getting rich off of religious.
Yeah. And Jesus also never condemned the poor for being lazy, never told them to get jobs, never told them solve your own problems, you're poor, like we see so many Christians doing today.
I mean, people in general.
Yeah.
But
well, okay, there's an awful lot of people who have no value or worship for Jesus, who hate the poor. Fine.
But when your dude is telling you something and you're not listening, absolutely, that's a different story.
There's an awful lot of people in love with Jesus who don't love Jesus enough to even learn what he says, let alone do as he says. And that's frustrating to me.
Yep. Now we're going to talk about some specific communists.
So we talked about this fella, St. Thomas More, a little while ago.
He was
a saint who maybe shouldn't have been
a saint. But not for this reason.
No, there's more.
There's more. So we talked about his love of book burning specifically. That's why he wasn't allowed to be a saint, right?
Well, yeah, it's weird calling him a saint when he's like, no, if you read the Bible, you're a bad Christian.
Oh, right, yeah.
And I mean, there's a lot of Christians in North America today who seem to have jumped on that bandwagon.
Yeah. So he was the first person, I thought this was super interesting. He was the first person to use the word utopia, was the title of one of his books. It's a pun from the Greek word utopos, meaning good place, and utopos, meaning nowhere.
A place that is so great it couldn't possibly exist.
Can't even exist. So in this novel, he talks about communal ownership, equal education for men and women, religious tolerance, except they still hate atheists. So anything other than an atheist is fine. And legal euthanasia. Like, these are some very we're still debating this today, 20th and 21st century ideas of...
Our federal government has legalized euthanasia for people. It's a little bit weird how easy it is.
It's very easy.
Yeah. In fact, our government basically encourages people with mental disabilities or mental illnesses to just go ahead and kill yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of gross.
That's too much. Yeah, no, that's actually terrible. But someone I am acquainted with, her father-in-law has chosen assisted death. So yeah, interesting. Mm-hmm. He has cancer, so not the gross stuff of oh, you're sick, goodbye. I mean, I guess he is sick, but obviously it's terminal cancer. So St. Thomas More is known, and he was executed for refusing to take the oath of supremacy, making Henry VIII head of the Church of England. So he was stated for his martyrdom. But yeah, he had all of these very, like, what we would call left policies now of utopia and sharing everything and women getting an education. What the fuck?
Right? What a mess.
What a mess, women getting educated. I'm kidding.
Speaking of the 1500s and the weird beginnings of Protestantism in Europe, there's a fella named John Calvin. We've mentioned him a couple of times before.
Yeah, we have. Weird guy.
I mean, a little bit. He was a French pastor who didn't stay in France. He traveled around a lot, learned a lot, and really jumped on board this Reformation business. In addition to claiming that the Catholic Church couldn't possibly be Catholic because they hate the diversity of thought, he also claimed that all people are predestined to eternal glory or damnation. Nothing you can do will ever change your fate. This is one of the things that people highlight when they think of Calvinist theology.
Calvinism's pretty brutal.
Yeah. And it's not that he liked this idea. He has said on a couple of occasions he doesn't think that it's a terribly hopeful theology, but he can't see any way around it. He's convinced that this is the way it is. And I think most Calvinists feel exactly the same way. It's not hopeful, it's not great, but this is what we believe.
I mean, I'm kind of the same with atheism. People are like, so you think there's nothing after death? That must be horrible. I'm like, yeah, it kind of is. I don't like it. But, yeah.
Right?
Shit.
Makes sense. He declared that there are only two sacraments, baptism and the Lord's Supper, though he also was very strictly anti-transubstantiation. He's like, saying the bread is flesh is crazy, but the bread's important, the wine's important.
But it is not literally.
It's not literally Jesus.
Because that's cannibalism.
Right? And cannibalism is not a bandwagon that we should be excited to jump on. Mm-mm. But, I mean, it's not the worst possible thing to be teaching people. It's just really weird.
Only if there's consent to be eaten.
And there's a growing market in this field, so
interesting.
We've got that.
Oh, okay.
And one, I mean, as far as the story of Jesus, if you believe in transubstantiation, there is consent to be eaten.
Fair.
He did say, "Eat this."
This is my body, and this is
exactly
my fair. Yep.
So there's not a consent problem here. So that's good.
Good.
Anyway, Calvin was one of the early advocates for the complete separation of church and state.
Love it.
Right? Except for when he actually talked about it. Turns out, as much as he said he liked the separation, he could not actually wrap his head around it. He said that rulers who turn against God should be deposed, and that the state should execute heretics. So that's
confusing.
Not separation.
That's not. Nope.
But an interesting fella anyway. He was also one of the first Christians to defend capitalism and usury.
Oh.
Yeah.
He sounds like a confused man.
I mean, he thought of himself as an intellectual and pragmatic guy. Like, some of these things, they just don't make sense in the world anymore, so let's abandon them. Yeah. Thanks, John. He did like the idea of democracy, but definitely felt that it was important to preserve aristocracy. And so combining those two. So like, yeah, you can have the vote, but these people's votes are more important. Calvinism, very popular in the States, especially if you want to look at how their electoral system is built. It's a disaster, and I'm not a fan. But, I mean, the country hasn't actually burned down yet. Yeah. Interesting. John Calvin's an interesting fella, and a lot of people really like his thoughts. And some of them are easy to get on board with. Others are like, how was your day going, John? Anyway.
I liked how sassy he was for relics.
Sure.
I do have some respect for him for that.
Yeah, recognizing that a lot of the relics are problematic.
Weird.
And very weird. Go and check out that episode. You Want a Piece of Me was what that one was called. Mm-hmm. But yeah, generally today, Christians, not very friendly to socialism. The Cold War definitely helped with that.
Red Scare, yeah.
Yeah, the communists are our enemies. Those godless communists. I mean, yeah, Russia and China, their state religion, to say, was focus on the community and the head of state. There is no God, was the official stance of these states. So, okay, godless communists is more or less factual, but their economic policies wasn't why they were the enemy.
Yes.
Oh, well. It's weird that there's so many Christians who are way too happy to say that God only wants your willing gifts, when God wants all of our best. If you believe in God, he wants you to be a specific way. And sure, you can rebel against that. That doesn't mean that God wants you to be super awful to each other. It's easier to just say there's no God than try and be a believer in a God that definitely is your own fiction.
Yes. And then, the doctrine we've talked about, the piece of the Bible we've talked about, then it's like, well, why wouldn't it be willing then?
Right.
Right. So there's, sure, maybe he doesn't want you to give unwillingly, but what are you unwilling to give? Mm-hmm. Do you give why wouldn't you give your money to the homeless man on the street corner? Why are you unwilling to do that?
Yeah.
And if you have your own poverty, that's a different story. But if you're in a place to do it, why would right?
Yeah.
So sure, maybe he doesn't want you to be give unwillingly, but it sounds like there should be no reason for you to be not willing to give.
It's another thing that really frustrates me in this whole thing is that, like the missionary that refuses to talk to me anymore, it's a really weird position to stand in, where you can say, I'm a Christian, I believe the Bible and everything in it, but socialism is evil. No, if you think socialism is bad, then you can't possibly have cared very much about the things Jesus says.
Or you don't understand what socialism is.
Right. And there is a fair bit of that. A lot of people just jump on the Red Scare, socialism bad, without putting any thought into it. That's embarrassing. But it is a reality. It's frustrating to see people stand up at the pulpit and knowingly contradict Jesus and then say, follow me, and still wear the label of Christian. It's gross to me. But I see it a lot more often than I would like.
I'm sure. I just see it in, I would say, like pop culture and social media, right? The things you see about churches. Mm-hmm. You see, we'll do a whole episode on prosperity gospel one day, and that's super gross.
Yeah. Learn more about communism. Learn more about socialism. Learn more about the world around you.
Christianity.
And if you really believe in a thing, learn more about that thing. Mm-hmm. If you're going to be reading the Bible, read it to see what's in it. Read it to learn what's in it. Not just looking for something that validates your prejudices.
I like that. That was a good summary.
And we've also got Katie's first real Bible study on our Patreon.
2 Bible studies on our Patreon.
Yeah, we're a couple episodes in now. We're having some good times with that.
Yeah, I'm all the way to First Kings.
Very nice.
So there you go. If you want to know more about the Bible specifically, we are doing Katie Does the Bible Study on Patreon. If you want to share the wealth.
Let's make this a real business.
If you want to share with the poor. I'm kidding. We do have our Patreon. It does help us keep this podcast going and hopefully be producing more content more frequently. If the subscription model is not your thing, we also have our Spreadshirt.
So much good merch.
So much good merch. We have new merch launching as well all the time. So that's the socialism plug for money. But also please join us on our social media, which is free.
Right? Yay, socialism.
Yay, social media. Socialism.
Right?
What
a coincidence.
We're building a community on Discord. Yes, check out our Discord, Instagram, Facebook. We have some great conversations on Discord in particular. And that's all for this week.
Thanks for joining us.
Peace be with you.
By the late Middle Ages, the Christian prophecy had fulfilled itself.